Welcome to All Clear, the podcast that takes you beyond the rails. Brought to you by the team at Australian Jumping, this podcast dives into the stories, the people, and the horses shaping our sport. Whether you're a seasoned competitor or simply love the thrill of the clear round, All Clear delivers the conversations that matter. Hit subscribe and join us for a fresh perspective on the sport you love. Today we're joined by one of the most respected figures in Australian jumping, Sanna. George has represented Australia at the highest level, including the Olympic Games, and has played an instrumental role in developing the sport as a coach and as a mentor. His knowledge and experience, both in and out of the saddle, gives him a unique experience on where Australia stands today and what the future might hold. George, it's a privilege to have you with us. Welcome.
Not a privilege, but it's nice to be here.
George, you've had the advantage of experiencing this sport as a top rider and a coach. And from where you sit, how would you describe the current condition of jumping in Australia, our riders, our horses, competitions, and the overall system?
Okay. Well, starting horses, I think our breeders are doing a good job. The warm blood experience, because we were fundamentally a thoroughbred country until, like the 90s. And we did well with the thoroughbreds, especially in eventing, of course. But there were some very good jumpers amongst them as well. But I think our breeders have really, obviously the changes in the science of breeding and being able to bring in the best stallions effectively through the semen, and the mares being able to compete and produce multiple foals yearly and still compete. All of that, I think, has come to us developing a strong collection of young horses that are available every year to the sport, both in dressage and jumping. I think it's now not a must to go overseas to find a nice horse, but the numbers, of course, are still infinitesimally small compared to Europe. But I think the quality of the horses, by and large, is improving all the time, and we're getting a lot of very, very nice horses that are being bred. They're moving to riders. I think certainly compared to, say, 20 years ago or more, if you went off to do clinics, especially in some far-flung places in Australia, it was really, really backward. Well, you don't strike that anywhere anymore. Everywhere you go, people have got a good understanding of why it's necessary to train horses on the flat and to do that preparatory work. Sometimes the management is still a little bit old school, with young horses a little too much focused on winning. But at the same time, I think, when you look at a decent show like the World Cup show or a major show in any of the eastern seaboard states, and West Australia, I'm sure, is the same. The standard of riding is infinitesimally better than it used to be. And the management in terms of health and horse care, I think, is generally quite good. Management in terms of managing a horse's career is sometimes lacking, and I think a few horses fall through the cracks along the way because of that. I think moving on to the competitions, I think competitions are way, way, way better. To the point when I first started, the only competitions effectively that were there were agricultural shows, and obviously the royal shows were the premier ones of those, but the agricultural shows. But I would say, by and large, in New South Wales, most Sydney-based people for sure the younger ones have never been to an agricultural show. And I haven't been to an agricultural show for 10 years or more, because there's enough good quality shows that are run by jump clubs and by the state discipline committees and such. So we can compete 2 or 3 times a week very comfortably, and as much as you really want, weather permitting, without really having to go too fast. And their major shows are excellent. And so whereas, the conditions that we faced when we were doing agricultural shows, where where the arenas were hard or were soft, the jumps were substandard, the course building was often not great, stables were non-existent or dangerous. So, those days are sort of rather behind us. But I'm not saying that for a moment that the agricultural shows still have an important part for people in rural areas. And we certainly produced horses to go to the Olympics from agricultural shows, but I'd like to think that we've transcended that a bit. So, and I think the other piece of the puzzle is coaching. I think there's a really great selection of good coaches around now. Maybe not so much in rural areas, but even there are some that live in the country that are great. But in the major cities or around the major cities, I think generally the message that's being put out is consistent and very oriented towards the new demographic in riding, which is generally people in the city areas that have not grown up with horses. Like when I was young, 90% of the competitors were really people who were rurally based, and they grew up with horses, and they sort of went to pony club, and then they felt they had a bit of a skill for jumping, and off they went, and they went on the circuit. And now it's quite different, but at the same time, I think the level of coaching and managing people's careers and the right horses at the right time, I think that is something that's been a really great improvement in the sport in the last sort of 15 years, 20 years.
What do you see are our most pressing challenges now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they're the same challenges that, well, it depends on what you're defining a challenge as. If you're talking about going, presenting a competitive team at the Olympic Games, that's a challenge. But if you're talking about just the challenge of running our sport in this country and catering for people at the very grassroots level to mid-level to elite level, I think that challenge is being met pretty well. We've tweaked the grading system, which allows a whole lot more flexibility in what people can start a horse in. And, when I was younger, once a horse was A grade, on his performances, he became A grade, then that was it. And if he wasn't quite good enough to jump A grade, which is by and large a meter 50 plus, then he couldn't do anything else. He couldn't sell it to a junior or an amateur or anything like that. He was stuck in A grade. So those things have changed. So now we're getting a lot of recycling of really lovely horses that have been well produced and had a heap of experience, and they can find a home with amateurs and juniors and young riders. So the system is way better geared to promote progress at all levels of the sport. If you're talking about Olympics and that sort of stuff, that is a challenge because of the need to probably finish a preparation that might start in Australia. You bring a young horse on and it becomes let's say a World Cup winner in Australia, and then he's got to go that next level, probably to warrant selection in a team to go to a major championship, and do some 4 and 5 stars, which are the jumps are the same. They use the same tape measure and everything like that, but it is another level, and so that requires money because there's not really a lot of financing certainly for jumping. Eventing gets good funding from high performance, but jumping doesn't. And so it's basically got to be self-funded. That's a severe challenge for a lot of people to embark on that sort of a trip to Europe. So they've really got to know that the horses, got the goods to do that. And then if the horse is a really nice horse, then they've got to resist the opportunities that will come straight away for people to, they will make offers on it. So you've got to be able to financially say no. But having said that, there's also a lot more money has come into the sport compared to a couple of decades ago. There's a lot more people who can self-fund these initiatives and take on a little bit of a campaign in Europe to bring a horse up to that level. But right now, it relies on those people doing that or having owners who can do that for them. So that's a challenge because, I would say there's probably only one horse maybe every year that you could say that bobs up in Australia and is at the right sort of the right career path for an upcoming Olympics or World Championship. Probably one a year, and so So that's not enough to make a team with. So then you got to look at what's overseas, and because there are a lot of riders based overseas right now. But again, they've got to have the right horses at the right time. In Europe, it's still, even if you're based there, it's not easy to get into the shows. It's not easy to give them that high end mileage that they need. It's not unheard of that you've got to pay 20 or 30,000 euros, which is like almost $50,000 to even get a start in a 5-star show. So it's pretty daunting.
Do you think that there's anything that Australia needs to do now, realistically, to prepare? Is there anything we can be doing better as a country, as a federation?
I think everyone's got a job to do, but Australia doesn't have any finance within jumping and dressage, for that matter, to actually offer much assistance to riders who want to do that. And so I think the best we can do is to have our shows here as good as they can be. I mean, we took a horse over last year, Nopal Van Tallet, and he, on the back of an Australian preparation, because we bought him, he came out of Europe as a 6-year-old. He's only jumping 120. But on the back of Australian shows and Australian preparation, he went to Europe as a 9-10-year-old, and he went straight into 4 and 5-star and jumping double clear round. So it's like, I think that's sort of the best. That's sort of the best we can do is to make our shows as good as we can do. Get the very best course builders. We have several excellent course builders in this country, but I think trying to bring in high-level course designers from overseas is also a very important part of improving our sport here. But right now, that financial cost rests on the organising committees. It's already expensive enough to run a World Cup. There are so many requirements from the FBI with overseas judges and myriads of stewards and all that sort of stuff. It's very, very expensive to run them. Then to add the cost of bringing in an overseas course designer, which must be at least 20 or 30 grand, you'd think. So you've got to hand it to the organising committees. Like we've just at Waratah, we've had an excellent course builder. It's great that they're doing that, but it's a huge cost, and it's not a cost that's being borne by the sport. It's being borne by individuals who run shows, that sort of stuff, and equipment and grounds and all that sort of stuff, and trying to keep the standard at the highest levels strong. Don't pander to people who enter the classes who really probably shouldn't be there. Our major World Cups, especially the outdoor World Cups, I think they need to build them, at least 4-star level in Europe.
Before we continue with this chat, I would like to thank Divas Beverages for sponsoring this podcast and for all they do for our jumping community. Divas Beverages is a business that truly gives back to the sport we love. Visit divasbeverages.com.au to explore their full range of carefully crafted premium beverages. Now back to our guests. You were at Waratah, and you mentioned the course design there. What stood out to you about the tracks that Anderson built and the way that he tested the competitors?
Well, it's interesting because nothing really stood out. It was just really subtle. When you walk the lines, they were not that you'd say, wow, that's pretty challenging. But then he would have it was like subtle course building, in that he'd have a certain jump at the end of a certain line that was just took a bit of jumping with that distance, or it was subtle. It's not a huge indoor there at Waratah, and there always appeared to be plenty of room to get onto. It was lovely course building. But I'm not saying that we don't have a couple of designers that couldn't do the same, but it was subtle. It was slightly different in fence placement than I've seen in that arena. But there always seemed to be plenty of time to get around each end and do the rollbacks and things like that. You weren't under a lot of pressure. So it was, as I say, there was nothing that really stands out, but it was consistent. You didn't build one track that you thought, oh God, that's not going. It was just very consistent, encouraged horses to be ridden forward and to jump, which our better course builders do as well now. Maybe they're just a little bit more adventurous sometimes, the internationals, but it was just really, really consistent, really, and just tweaked it up a little bit, a little bit more distance variation on the last day than the others. And certainly the time was tweaked up a little bit as the show went on. And by the last day, the time was a significant factor, but not so much in the earlier classes.
Because I have heard from a few people that I've interviewed previously that when they do go overseas, the time seems to be the thing that catches them out.
Yeah. Look, I think that is true. By and large, we didn't find the times much tighter than our most senior course builders build, a little for sure. But then, they've got 50 amazing horses in the class, and they can't build any bigger than the wings go, and they still jump clear round. So the time becomes a factor. I think for us, like we've got to learn, but just because the lines are like a standard distance, like a related distance now is probably 10% longer than it used to be. Going back not that long ago, a standard force ride would be just a generous 20 yards or whatever the metric equivalent of that is. And now it would be 21, 22, you know what I mean? So I think, that already it creates more pace. I think, yes, time a part of the sport, but just to be really brutally frank, for us to compete, at a championship level, if you have 4 fences down chasing the time and only one risking a time fault, it's still a pretty bit, it's a much better option if you're already struggling to jump the jumps to then I think traditionally, time faults are considered to be, this is my personal view, and a lot of people disagree with it. In the end, if you go to Europe and you spend a bit of time in Europe, you will accustom yourself to the time very, very quickly. But your horse is already going to become more accustomed to jumping those jumps. But when you get over there, when you first go over there, and your horse is, thinking, "Wow, this is pretty tough, pretty big." Well, I think if you're chasing time as well, then I think that's dumb. But once he's familiar with the jumps, once he's comfortable with the jumps, once he's jumping clear rounds regularly, then okay, go 2 or 3 seconds quicker. But at the same time, try leaving the jump stops. The first and foremost, most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got the Olympics coming up, and they're in LA, and I think we need to, for a minute, just go back in time a little bit to 1984. And you were in the LA Olympics then, and it was at the same location that it's going to be in 28 at Santa Anita Park. Can you tell us a little bit about your Olympic experience and I guess what it feels like for you to realize that the next games will be in that same location?
Yeah, going to Olympics obviously is a huge thrill, and it's an honor and a privilege. I personally had a pretty rough time leading up to LA for a variety of things that were going on in the federation, and I ended up not riding my best horse. I had 2 horses in the team, and I rode my other one, which was an 8-year-old at the time. It was pretty green, and so all of that was sort of challenging and difficult. But the games experience itself was fantastic. Although I think a world championship is actually much more enjoyable and relaxing to compete at, even though it's the same sort of challenge, but the Olympics, especially those Olympics, the security was mind-boggling because they just, they'd had Munich and such, and it was in America. There were guns everywhere, and there were helicopters above the sleeping quarters all night, and it was pretty heavy duty. But the sport itself was great, and Santa Anita it's a racetrack, but they'd adapted it for the Olympics, and it was a great experience. I loved it. It was my first Olympics, so that's always special. And my horse did very well. He was very green, and he was a bit shell shocked, but he jumped great. And I don't know what they're doing for accommodation this time around. Last time they used the residences for the universities, UCLA and USC, for accommodation, but I don't know if they do that again. But it was a lot of fun. There were rock bands at the venues, and it was great. I enjoyed it a lot.
You were in Paris, and if you just look at the progression of the Olympics over the years, what have been the biggest changes that you've noticed since, I guess, your first games and up to Paris last year?
Well, there are a lot. First and foremost, you'd have to say horse welfare. Especially with the eventers. Because it's the Summer Olympics they're in summer and they're often really hot. In August and places like that. It's in the northern hemisphere. It is really hot. Especially the next one I went to, Seoul, was very hot, and Los Angeles is famously hot and humid. But horse welfare, I think, and just just way more attention to the horses' comfort and welfare and performance. And I guess the other thing, there have been advances in footing, obviously. Los Angeles was on sand, and as was Seoul. But I think the courses, the level of course, Los Angeles was considered to be the first of the modern Olympics, because it was traditional. They were just gut busters. I mean, if it took a horse to the Olympics, it would probably never be the same again. It was just jumps were just massive, and heavy gear, and if there was a clear round at all, there'd only be one. And Los Angeles was built. The course designer there was a Hungarian guy who's a friend of my father's, actually, a guy called Bert Nemeth, who had been the American coach for some time, and he built it there. And it was considered to be the first Olympics where the gear was lighter and not as massive. And it probably was true, because I hadn't been to Olympics before then. But if I look back on it now, I've actually got a picture on my wall of my horse jumping the treble, and the treble is redwood rails with these massive, heavy, sort of solid-looking gates. And there was an oxer with massive. It would have been a meter 55 by a meter 65 or something huge. They used to jump massive jumps there, and solid to an oxer an oxer to a triple bar to an oxer. Like that was considered to be, light and generous. And I think I was quite early out. I was about 7th or 8th out, and I think I was the first one that got through the combination. I was riding a thoroughbred, so if you kicked it, it went. But it was pretty daunting, and so if you look at that, was already considered to be modern. So, and if you look at the courses now, which are so delicate and so light and so, you just wonder how any horse jumps clear, but they're not being busted like that. So that's been the major development in show jumping generally, but especially Olympics and big championships and that sort of stuff. So I guess you'd say that that's probably the main things.
If you could give one piece of advice to a young Australian rider with World Championship or Olympic dreams, what would it be?
Well, become the best rider you can. That's the first thing, because if you don't ride well, it's not going to happen. It doesn't matter, what horse get put underneath you or something like that. So be the best rider you can be. Really, don't be a hindrance to your horse. Be an asset to your horse, and learn to be competitive, but at the same time learn to do it very well. And then the other bit of advice is, find the best horses you can. If you're lucky, you might have people around you who can help you with that. Or if you ride incredibly well, well, then opportunities will come your way. You might have to deal with a bit of shit in the meantime and work in situations that you don't love. But if you're a super talent, then opportunities will come your way, and you'll end up in that situation. But the first thing you got to do is ride extremely well. That's sort of like not revolutionary advice, but it's just the way it is, obviously.
So finally, we've got a tradition that I started on this podcast where the previous guest leaves a question for the next guest, so they don't know who that guest is. The question for you comes from Sam Overton, and I think he's going to laugh when he finds out that it was you that he was asking, because he wants to know what level do you think you can get to as a rider from 1 to 10. So I think in this instance, maybe there's something that you can share around what it takes mentally to get to the top of a sport, as a rider.
Obviously, to get to the top of the sport, to be a mix of technically extremely proficient, which is what I talked about a second ago. You're technically proficient, that you ride well, that you have great feel for the horse, that you have to be a competitor. You've got to be a risk taker, but sensible, calculated. All good sports people are risk takers. In most of them in life as well as in their sport. I mean, that's what makes them tick, and that's what makes them good. So I have a sort of a theory that at the very top of any sport, be it Formula One or soccer or jumping or dressage or whatever, that in the end, the ones that supremely successful compared to the ones that are very good at their sport and moderately successful is just what was born in them. I mean? Just that capacity for risk, that capacity for overcoming adversity, those sort of character traits that just make one person who's very, very skilled be slightly better than another person who's very, very skilled. So it's sort of like a born quality in many ways.
Yeah.
You can acquire skill, but the really, really special ones, that you just got that little bit of X factor that makes them special.
And do you have a question that you can think of that you could leave for our next guest, not knowing who the guest would be?
You warned me about this and I'd forgotten about it. So not knowing who that guest is, a question about our sport of jumping.
Yeah, about the sport of jumping. Or it can be a personal question.
So, okay, well, I'd like that person to answer the question of what they think Australia can do better. Because I answered that question myself, and it's such a big question. What they think Australia could do better to prepare. I think we're doing pretty well about presenting the sport to the members of EA and to the people who are interested in the sport. I think we're doing pretty well with that. But I remember we did a forum many, many years ago, and the theme of the forum was they had administrators and some riders and coaches and trainers, and they just, if money is no object, and let's say there were no limitations, how are we going to get a medal in show jumping? And my answer to that, and this is what I'd like to answer. I'd like to ask the next one, what do you think we need to do? I think if there are no limitations, get the very best riders and put them on the best horses we can afford. And, and Chris Burton is a perfect example of that. All of those millions that were spent on the high performance program yielded diddly squat for the eventers, except for Chris Burton, who is an extremely good rider, as we know, found himself an amazing horse, rustled up the money without help from the performance program, and went out and got a medal. And that's sort of the answer. But that's my answer to that question. I'd be interested to see what other people think is the answer to that question.
Yeah, that's fantastic. George, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. I've really appreciated it, and it's been really great listening to your insights on the sport and where we stand and how we move forward. So thank you very much indeed.
It's a huge pleasure. I'm always happy to talk about show jumping, that's for sure.